Disclaimer, I said in the intro that I'll be using clips for this video, but due to Aniplex striking even power scaling channels that use clips, I'm just not willing to risk it, so I'll be using them sparingly, and whenever I do, it'll be pixelated, grayed out, or some other way of blocking them. If you wanted to see the clips, this video isn't gonna have that, and whenever I do use them, I'll just have to trust that you guys have seen the movie to know what's happening. But that's about it. Enjoy the video. With the Demon Slayer Infinity Castle movie finally coming to official streaming services after 10 months since its theatrical release in the States, it's finally the perfect time for me to cover topics from the movie, use clips, etc. With the main event of the movie being Giyu and Tanjiro vs Akaza, it only made sense for me to go over that first. However, due to most of the stuff in the fight being relatively clear, unlike talking points from Shinobu vs Doma, like did Doma go all out on her, is Shinobu a secret top 3 Hashira, both of which are a no by the way. It does make coming up with an interesting discussion surrounding this fight to be relatively difficult at face value. However, there actually is a pretty good discussion to be had, which if you clicked on this video you can probably tell, would be a hypothetical rematch between Akaza and Giyu with prior knowledge on each other's abilities, which at a glance, you're probably looking at me like,
Atto, are you dumb? The fight happened and Giyu got steamrolled and needed to get bailed out by Tanjiro.
To that, I would say that yes, there is no doubt that Akaza was above Giyu within their fight, but to make things interesting, I thought it would be cool if Giyu started out with the biggest asset he gained from the Muzan fight, which was his Red Blade, and pit him up against Akaza. Could he win? Before we fully get into the fight, for the Akaza fans watching this, yes, Giyu in a normal combat setting would never be able to pull this off. Not only did he have to clash with Sanemi to gain the Red Blade, but even if we say he can get it normally through grip strength, which to be fair is likely since he's probably physically stronger than Obanai, he'd still be left in a similar situation as Obanai to where he'd have to nearly pass out to gain it, which Akaza would just take that moment to kill him if he did. But you don't need me to tell you that. The fight happened on screen, this is just a fun hypothetical, and if you want to know how this would realistically happen, let's just say Tanjiro found the Dragon Balls and for some reason wished for Giyu to spawn in fully healthy, give him a permanent Red Blade, and he revived Akaza with all of his previous intel on Giyu. With that being established, let's just get into finding out who would win if these two came to blows once more. Due to the Red Blade being the main change in this rematch as opposed to the original fight, the most important question to be asked is what it adds to Giyu's arsenal. The Red Blade essentially negates the regeneration of a demon, or temporarily slows it down for a period of time. We have it shown on multiple occasions that the Red Blade inhibits a demon's ability to regenerate, like against Hantengu in a weakened version of Muzan, which is caused by heating up your katana via your own grip strength, clashing it with metal, or through unorthodox methods like Nezuko's flames. It also likely grants an increase your attack potency, with Zenitsu blatantly stating his attacks on Muzan are too shallow and that only a bright red blade can do enough damage. With that being established, it's very clear why this would be a detriment to Akaza if Giyu landed these attacks on him. Muzan is blatantly shown to have the highest regeneration speed out of any demon, with his regen being so fast it seems like blades just flow right through his body. And even he is susceptible to this to a point where his regeneration is slowed for at least a couple seconds on panel if I had to guess, via Sanemi's dialogue and how he notes the significant impact it has on Muzan. So it's pretty safe to say that if Akaza were to be hit by this blade and lose a limb or two, it's gonna grant Giyu significant openings to go for even further damage like cutting his legs off or just outright decapitation. Another factor that makes this bad for Akaza is his own fighting style, unironically. We've seen on multiple occasions that Akaza tends to not really dodge attacks and is fine taking damage in exchange for going for offense of his own. We have this shown with examples like him letting himself get sliced in the chest by Rengoku to then deal lethal damage of his own with his disorder. He's always getting his limbs sliced off in scenarios where he can likely dodge if he wanted to, so if he tries the strategy against Giyu's Red Blade, it's going to put him in a really bad position. Before writing this video, I thought that maybe Akaza would have prior knowledge on the Red Blade and maybe knew to be wary of it as a result. This possibility was founded on the idea that demons share information with each other, and Kokushibo did seemingly know the events of the fight with Akaza via him stating that Akaza ended his own life. However, through further digging, there isn't really anything to imply Akaza would know about the Red Blade. In fact, there's evidence for the contrary. This is actually pretty blatantly shown in the fight with Kokushibo, when Muichiro activates his Red Blade against Kokushibo. Not only is he verbally surprised about his blade turning red, but he also says it's just like Yorichi's, which if we interpreted this literally, it wouldn't make sense, because Muzan later states that none of the current generation Hashir's Red Blades are even close to Yorichi's in terms of potency, which is even further established with Yorichi being able to burn at prime Muzan's nigh instant regeneration for hundreds of years, to the point that his scars remain to this day. So a more reasonable way to interpret Kokushibo's statement is that this is the first time he's seen a bright red blade since Yorichi's, which is consistent with him remembering their talk about how there will be a future generation that will surpass them. So with that being said, this would mean that the red blade would not only be super lethal against Akaza regeneration, but his fighting style is also a detriment in this context due to a loss of limbs here being something Giyu can capitalize on. A small but big enough counter argument that I've seen against Giyu is that he isn't relative to Akaza in speed. People try and infer this from Akaza's dialogue at the end of their little scuffle, that he's seen all of Giyu's water forms and that it's time to end the fight, which is then coupled with him doing something he seemingly never did before, which was go for the side of Giyu's blade to break it. This argument ignores a bit of context. Not only has Giyu been fighting Akaza for a prolonged amount of time, which Tanjiro notes at the start of their fight will eventually lead to him losing due to fatigue, but it also assumes that going for the side of Giyu's blade means he was holding back before in physical stats. This notion isn't really founded anywhere. We see earlier in the fight against Tanjiro that Akaza only went for Tanjiro's blade when he was put in a favorable position to do so, which was a similar downward swing that Giyu does, which is seemingly just a more tactical approach rather than Akaza holding back prior, and he could have done it the entire time and just chose not to. This then leads into the question of, does Giyu scale to Akaza in speed? And the answer is just a simple yes. Even if you wanted to skepticize the idea that Akaza lets himself get hit and he could have been holding back his attack speed, one undeniable fact is that he will avoid attacks at his neck. We see in the fight with Tanjiro and Rengoku that he tries to avoid any attempt at cutting his head off, which is just obvious considering that's his weak point. With that being considered, we see that Giyu can consistently slit Akaza's throat. The first instance being when he first unlocks his mark, and the second instance being much later on into the fight when he uses constant flux. Since we know Akaza doesn't let his neck get slit or hit in the first place, it would have to require that Giyu have some higher level of relativity to Akaza in speed, which means his attacks are going to be landing regardless of whether Akaza knows about his red blade or not, and tries to dodge as a result. With everything talked about up until now, I think there are two scenarios I see playing out for this fight, and I'll just be going over both of them separately. The first scenario in my mind is that they start the fight completely normal, exchanging in mutual strikes, you get the drift. Akaza's gonna lose a limb or two and realize he isn't able to regenerate as fast as he normally can, which will be Giyu's best opportunity to go for a critical strike to his neck, which as established prior is highly likely since Akaza and Giyu are already highly relative including Akaza's arms, so Akaza not having them plus his initial confusion will likely be enough for Giyu to cut his head off entirely. This won't be the end of the fight since Akaza can survive without his head, but not only is his regeneration going to be slowed due to the red blade, but his body will be less durable and likely slower since it's stated by Gyome that Kokushibo's body was fragile after decapitation, and Giyu implies Akaza should be slower or is outright slower after losing his head. This is all coupled with the fact that Giyu is already going to have prior knowledge that Akaza can regenerate and fight without his head, which will mean that he's not going to let up any pressure and keep cutting his body up until Akaza can no longer regenerate. We know that enough damage with the red blade can stop a demon's regeneration entirely, because Kokushibo's body starts to crumble and his regeneration basically goes out on him after Muichiro had his red blade in his guts for a prolonged amount of time. For the people in the back who will bring up that this only happened because Kokushibo quote-unquote gave up due to seeing his hideous state, I want you to remember that even after Akaza starts becoming conflicted on continuing the fight, damaging himself, and wanting his regeneration to stop, is still able to passively regenerate against his will. And his regeneration only really stops after he stops becoming conflicted and completely gives up on the fight. This isn't what happens to Kokushibo, since we see even in his final moments he's trying to fight back and trying to unleash a new technique, and is more conflicted rather than outright done with the fight like Akaza was. And even with this in mind, he's unable to regenerate due to Muichiro's red blade. This all means that Giyu wins pretty overwhelmingly in this scenario if Akaza fights as he usually does, since Giyu will have plenty of openings to not only slow his regeneration down, but overwhelm it entirely and keep him from regrowing his head. The next realistic scenario I see playing out is Akaza noting Giyu's blade is red, which gives him slight flashbacks to Yorichi in a similar way it happened to Han Tengu. If this does happen, there is a realistic possibility that Akaza senses the danger from it, similar to how he sensed danger from Tanjiro, and goes all out from the beginning and uses Chaotic Afterglow to finish Giyu from the start. This would be a far more effective strategy, but I'm not convinced it would give Akaza the win. For those who don't remember the surrounding context, when Akaza used his final form on Giyu, he was already heavily weakened to the point that right before this, he was unable to react to a basic Akaza punch and had already taken multiple injuries and had been fighting Akaza for a prolonged amount of time. Not only that, but his sword was split in half, which would obviously decrease his range, but also likely drops the potency of his strikes, since we see that be the case with Muichiro when his blade is shipped. And we see in the final battle that it's significant enough of a hindrance that he feels the need to grab a fixed katana from a fallen water-breathing user. None of these would be a factor if Akaza used this on him. However, Akaza would probably be able to dish out more blows on Giyu since he won't be focused on him and Tanjiro, but I don't think it's fair to say to use all 100 simultaneous blows on Giyu, since we see even in the canon fight that Akaza more so uses it as a massive 360 degree area of effect attack, rather than concentrating the blows on Giyu and Tanjiro equally. So I'd say Giyu has more of a buff in this scenario than Akaza. With that covered, and the fact that even with all the nerfs established prior, Giyu is able to fend off Chaotic Afterglow without taking any fatal blows, I think it's safe to say Giyu is going to come out of this attack not completely unscathed, but not taking any fatal damage and less damage as well, so I don't think it'll hinder him much. The only saving grace for Akaza if this does happen is trying Chaotic Afterglow again. But I don't really see any reason he'd do this in character, since he doesn't try to do it against Tanjiro or Giyu after he sees Tanjiro survived it in the first time, when he realistically should be able to, since it doesn't have that much of a build-up time on panel. He kind of just activates it and launches it within the span of like 2 or 3 panels. So unless he does this very out of character move, I see the fight playing out rather similarly to round 1, except Akaza might be more wary of the blade and try to avoid taking damage from it, but like I already established, Giyu's fast enough to where Akaza's going to be taking damage and losing limbs regardless of whether he wants to or not. This would mean that Giyu's going to be able to create similar openings as the previous scenario and come out the victor, with the only meaningful difference being that it'll come at a much higher difficulty. If you made it to the end of this video, I hope you learned something from it. The idea of making this video actually came from Darkworld giving me the most basic rundown of how he thought this fight would go, which made me look more deep into it. For the Akaza fans out there, I'll just reiterate, this isn't a knock on Akaza at all. Giyu won't have the red blade in most fighting scenarios against him without outside help or risk of passing out. But with the red blade, I don't see many opportunities for Akaza to come out with a win. I'd say Giyu wins 95% of the time, with that extra 5% being if Akaza decides to just spam Chaotic Afterglow until Giyu's dead. If you want to see more inverse Demon Slayer matchups, make sure you like the video and share it, and maybe drop some topics down below related to the movie I could cover. But that's going to be it for me. Peace.